The air in Blackwood Valley doesn't just get cold. It turns into a razor that slices through the lungs of the unprepared. But in the sweltering heat of July, no one wanted to hear that. Especially not from a man who spent his afternoons hanging strips of venison over a smoke-stained pit instead of sipping cold beer at the local resort. William Wynne, a man whose skin was etched with the geography of forgotten wars, moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Beside him, Smoky, a German shepherd with eyes like amber fire, stood guard over the drying racks. To the new settlers, tech entrepreneurs and city dwellers seeking a rustic escape, William was a relic of a paranoid past. They pointed and whispered from their air-conditioned SUVs as he hauled crates of root vegetables into a bunker carved from the very mountain. "The war's over, Will," they'd shout with a smirk. But William didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could smell the change in the ozone, a metallic tang that whispered of a winter that would not just arrive, but conquer. His hands, callous and steady, continued to salt the earth's bounty, because he knew a fundamental truth they had forgotten. Nature doesn't negotiate, and it never grants a pardon to the arrogant. While the valley feasted on the temporary luxury of summer, the veteran and his dog were preparing for a siege. They called him a fool. They called him obsessed. But in the shadow of the peaks, the clouds were already beginning to gather a darkness that would soon turn their laughter into ice. The transition was not a gradual fade, but a violent seizure of the climate. Within 48 hours, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees. The vibrant greens of Blackwood Valley were choked out by a sky the color of cold iron. While the settlers scrambled to find their designer winter coats, William Wynne was already moving. He wasn't panicking. He was executing a plan. He checked the tension on the storm shutters, the reinforced steel plates he had bolted to the stone walls. Smoky followed his every move, his K9 instincts vibrating with the drop in barometric pressure. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that transformed into a deafening shriek as the first flakes fell. These weren't the soft, picturesque flakes of a Christmas card. They were shards of ice driven by 60-mile-per-hour gusts. In the valley below, the power grid flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the modern homes into a freezing darkness. The rustic escape had officially become a trap. William sat in his kitchen, the glow of a single oil lamp reflecting in his moss-green eyes. He wasn't celebrating his foresight. He was listening. He knew that the real test wasn't just surviving the cold, but surviving the desperation that would soon follow. He cracked open a jar of the venison he'd dried in July, sharing a piece with Smoky. Outside, the world was vanishing under a white shroud, and the laughter of the neighbors had been replaced by the terrifying sound of the mountains groaning under the weight of the coming avalanche. Day 3 of the Great Frost. The Thung Lung had disappeared. There were no roads, no landmarks, only a shifting, treacherous sea of white that reached the second-story windows of the settlers' homes. Inside his stone fortress, William Wynne checked his inventory. His meticulous preparation meant he had enough fuel, water, and dried nutrition to last 3 months. But the radio, the old shortwave unit he'd salvaged from his days in the service, was crackling with something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just static. It was the frantic, breaking voices of the people who had mocked him. "Is anyone there? We're freezing. No food. The roof is buckling." William looked at Smoky. The dog let out a low, guttural whine, sensing his master's internal conflict. William knew the risks. Opening his door meant inviting the sub-zero death inside. Venturing out meant risking an unmarked grave in the snow. But the code of the uniform never truly leaves a man. He didn't see the people who laughed at him. He saw civilians in a combat zone against an enemy that didn't bleed. He began to suit up, layers of thermal gear, a tactical harness, and a specialized sled he'd built for Smoky. He packed bags of the very dried meat and vegetables they had ridiculed. "Ready, boy?" William whispered. Smoky barked, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the roar of the wind. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a 2-man rescue team entering a white hell. The world had become a featureless void. Every step was a tactical gamble. William Wynne moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his military training overriding the primal urge to rush. Beneath his feet, the familiar landscape of Blackwood Valley was buried under 10 feet of packed powder and deadly air pockets. Beside him, Smoky was more than a companion. He was a biological sensor. The dog's nose, even in the biting sub-zero wind, could detect the scent of human fear and the faint metallic tang of gas leaks trapped beneath the snow. They reached the first house, a glass-walled architectural marvel that was now a shattered cage. The weight of the snow had imploded the roof. William didn't hesitate. He used his tactical axe to clear a path through a frozen window frame. Inside, he found a young couple huddled under a designer rug, their skin the color of ash, shivering in the final stages of hypothermia. They looked at the giant of a man in the tactical gear as if he were a ghost. Without a word, William reached into his pack. He didn't offer words of comfort. He offered the only thing that mattered, calories and heat. He handed them strips of the salted venison they had once mocked. As they chewed, life, slow, agonizing life, began to return to their eyes. But William was already checking his watch. There were 12 more houses in this sector, and the wind was picking up, screaming like a dying engine. He signaled Smoky. They had no time for gratitude. The White Death was still hungry, and the veteran was the only thing standing in its way. But nature wasn't done with its lesson. As William and Smoky reached the center of the valley, a sound more terrifying than the wind echoed through the peaks, a deep, resonant thump that vibrated in the soles of their boots. The snowpack was shifting. An avalanche was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. William knew he couldn't reach everyone. He had to prioritize. He utilized the K9 superior hearing to locate the most vulnerable targets. Smoky suddenly bolted toward a cluster of luxury cabins near the slope's base, his barks lost in the gale. William struggled to keep up, his lungs burning like they were filled with crushed glass. They arrived just as the first slide of snow began to pour down the ridge like a white river. In one cabin, a family was trapped behind a jammed door. William didn't have time for tools. He threw his entire muscular frame against the timber, the salt and pepper veteran becoming a human battering ram. On the third hit, the frame splintered. He dragged him out just as the back of the house was crushed by the weight of the mountain. There was no time for thanks. "Run to the ridge," he roared over the thunder of the falling snow. He watched them scramble towards safety, but his eyes were already scanning for the next soul. The valley was screaming, the ice was breaking, and William Wynne realized that his summer of paranoia had only bought them a few precious minutes of life. Night fell like a heavy obsidian shroud, and with it came the true enemy, the cold that stops the heart. William had gathered 30 survivors in the only structure strong enough to withstand the pressure, the very stone bunker they had laughed at months ago. The space was cramped, smelling of damp wool and fear. The settlers sat on the floor, huddled together, their high-tech gadgets now useless bricks without a signal or charge. In the center of the room, William moved among them like a silent guardian. He lit a small, efficient wood stove, the smoke venting perfectly through the system he'd engineered during the mad days of August. Then came the moment of truth. He opened the heavy steel canisters. The aroma of dried beef, salted pork, and dehydrated vegetables filled the air. These people hadn't eaten in days. They watched with wide, hollow eyes as a man they'd mocked began to reconstitute the food with melted snow. No one laughed now. The crazy veteran was the only reason their children weren't starving. As he handed out the warm bowls, one man, the same one who'd shouted from his SUV, tried to apologize. William simply put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't talk," he said, his voice like gravel. "Save your energy. The storm isn't over, and tomorrow we have to dig out the others." Outside, the wind screamed in frustration, unable to penetrate the stone and the will of the man and his dog. The fourth morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a dim, ghostly gray that filtered through the bunker's high ventilation slits. The storm had slowed its rhythmic screaming to a low, predatory growl. William Wynne stood by the heavy iron door, his moss-green eyes bloodshot but sharp, scanning the small perimeter he could see. The silence was more dangerous than the wind. It meant the snow had packed so tightly against the structure that they were effectively buried alive. "Stay back," he ordered the settlers, his voice like grinding stones. He knew the physics of a snow-in, if the weight was too great. Opening the door could trigger a structural collapse or an internal avalanche. William grabbed a specialized hydraulic jack he'd kept in the corner, another tool they called overkill during the summer, with Smoky barking a rhythmic warning to the others. William began the grueling process of forcing the door against thousands of pounds of frozen pressure. Every inch was a battle of muscle against mountain. His salt and pepper beard was matted with sweat, despite the cold. When the seal finally cracked, a wall of crystalline powder cascaded in, but William didn't flinch. He tunneled upward, a human mole in a tactical parka, until his hand broke through the surface into the blindingly bright, sub-zero air. He looked out over what used to be a valley. It was a graveyard of white mounds. But as he stood there, Smoky leaping out beside him, he saw a faint plume of smoke 3 miles out, the resort. They weren't done yet. The real rescue was only beginning. The Blackwood luxury resort, once a symbol of opulence and nature-themed comfort, had become a mausoleum of glass and steel. As William and Smoky approached, they could see the main atrium had collapsed. The smart glass that the developers bragged about had shattered under the weight of the ice, letting the killer cold inside. William moved through the wreckage with the silence of a ghost. Smoky's ears suddenly pinned back. He heard something. Not the wind, but a rhythmic tapping. William followed the dog to the lower kitchen area, which was reinforced by concrete. Inside, he found 40 more people, mostly staff and a few wealthy tourists, huddled around a single gas burner that was dangerously low on fuel. They were starving, dehydrated, and losing the will to fight. When William Wynne stepped out of the shadows, draped in frost and carrying a rucksack of dried meat, they didn't see the eccentric veteran anymore. They saw a god of survival. He immediately took command, his military bark cutting through their lethargy. Ventilate the area, move the shivering ones to the center. He began distributing the summer-dried vegetables, rich in minerals they desperately needed. He knew they couldn't stay here. The structural integrity was failing. He had to lead 80 people back to his bunker through a 3-mile corridor of lethal snow. It was a suicide mission, but as he looked at Smoky, he knew they were the only ones who could map the path. The journey back was a descent into a nightmare. 80 people, tied together by a single lifeline of paracord, trudged through the white void behind William and Smoky. The wind had returned with a vengeance, threatening to rip the breath from their lungs. Every few hundred yards, someone would stumble, falling into the deep powder, and the entire line would groan under strain. William was everywhere at once. At the front, breaking the trail through waist-deep drifts. Then at the back, hauling a fallen survivor up by their collar with his massive strength. Smoky was a scout, darting ahead to find solid ground and barking to signal the safe path. The cold was so intense it felt like physical blows. William's moss-green eyes were nearly frozen shut by ice on his lashes, but he refused to stop. He was fueled by a singular, burning discipline. He remembered the mockery, the crazy veteran labels, and he let that fire keep his blood from turning to ice. As they reached the halfway point, a massive snow bridge over a buried creek began to collapse. The line panicked. "Hold the line," William roared, his voice somehow louder than the gale. He threw himself onto the breaking snow, using his own body to bridge the gap and pulling the people across one by one. By the time the last person was over, William was nearly buried, his salt and pepper hair white with the frost of a man who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. The final few hundred yards were the deadliest. The survivors were no longer walking. They were crawling, their spirits broken by the unrelenting assault of the mountain. But then, through the veil of swirling white, the stone chimney of William's bunker appeared, a jagged finger of defiance pointing at the iron sky. William Wynne, his breath coming in ragged, frozen gasps, reached the tunnel entrance he had carved earlier. One by one, he funneled the 80 souls down into the earth, into the warmth that the settlers had once mocked as a paranoid's tomb. As the last person slid into the safety of the stone walls, William collapsed against the iron door, his strength finally spent. Smoky curled up beside him. The dogs coat a matted mess of ice and salt. Inside, the bunker was a miracle of logistics. The scent of wood smoke and the rich, earthy aroma of the dried vegetables and meat that William had prepared all summer acted like a tonic. People who hadn't spoken for days began to weep, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sensation of being alive. William sat in the shadows, his moss-green eyes watching the glow of the stove. He didn't ask for a thank you. He didn't need one. He had turned his madness into a sanctuary. The valley was gone, buried under 1,000,000 tons of ice, but inside the stone heart, humanity was still breathing. They were a community now, bound by the salt of the earth and the iron will of a veteran who knew that summer is just the time you have to prepare for the inevitable winter. Safety, however, was a relative term. 80 people in a space designed for 10 men, a new kind of war, a war of endurance. William Wynne immediately established a rotation. Every calorie was measured. Every scrap of dried food was a precious resource. He didn't just feed them, he put them to work. The survivors were divided into teams, snow melters for water, sanitation squads, and those who helped keep the air vents clear of the accumulating drifts outside. The mockery of the summer had been replaced by a desperate, almost religious obedience to William's orders. In the quiet hours of the night, as the mountain continued to groan and the wind outside howled like a wounded beast, the veteran stayed awake. He spent his time repairing gear and sharpening his knives. The rhythmic scrape of the stone against steel, a comforting heartbeat for the frightened civilians. Smoky remained at the door, a silent sentinel whose ears never stopped twitching. They were deep in the belly of the mountain, cut off from a world that likely thought they were dead. But as William looked at the faces of the people he'd saved, people who were now learning the value of salt, smoke, and preparation, he knew he wasn't just keeping them alive. He was teaching them how to survive. He was showing them that when the world ends, it's not the gadgets that save you. It's the calluses on your hands and the foresight in your soul. By the 10th day, the supplies were dwindling, and the psychological weight of the burial began to fracture the group. Arguments broke out over the smallest things. A misplaced cup, a loud snore. William Wynne watched it all with the detached patience of a man who had survived worse in foxholes half this size. He knew he needed to give them hope, or the bunker would become a cage of their own making. He spent hours at the shortwave radio, his fingers dancing across dials that had been silent for over a week. Suddenly, through the wall of white noise and solar interference, a voice broke through. It was faint, distorted by 1,000 miles of ice and static, but it was there. This is National Guard Rescue, searching for signals in Blackwood sector. The room went deathly silent. Every eye turned to the veteran. William didn't cheer. He grabbed the microphone with a hand that didn't tremble. This is Wynne. I have 80 civilians in a class 4 stone fortification. We are low on heat and air. Coordinates follow. As he transmitted their location, the realization hit the room like a physical wave. They weren't forgotten. The veterans' paranoia hadn't just saved their lives from the storm. It had provided the only radio powerful enough to scream through the white death and reach the world they thought they'd lost. William looked at Smoky and nodded. The mission was entering its final phase. Now, they just had to survive the wait. Hope is a double-edged sword. It brings relief, but it also breeds impatience. As another 24 hours passed without the sound of rotors, the air in the bunker grew thick with a new kind of tension. One group of survivors, led by a wealthy developer who was used to getting his way, began to question William's authority. They were tired of the rations, tired of the cold, and convinced they could dig their own way out now that the storm had died down. William Wynne stood by the exit, his moss-green eyes as cold as the permafrost outside. He knew what they didn't. The settling of the snowmen had turned into a concrete-like mass, and any amateur digging could cause a secondary collapse that would bury them all. "No one opens that door," William said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The developer stepped forward, his face flushed with cabin fever. "We're not your prisoners, Wynne. You're just a man with a basement and a dog." Smoky let out a warning growl, a sound that started in the depths of his chest and vibrated through the stone floor. William didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. He simply stepped into the light of the oil lamp, his massive frame and the scars of a dozen deployments reminding everyone in the room who had dragged him through the white hell. He explained the science of the snowpack with the cold precision of a demolition expert. The dissenters backed down, not because they were convinced, but because they finally understood. In this buried world, William Wynne wasn't just a veteran. He was a law of survival. Day 14. The air in the bunker had become thin and metallic, and the last of the salted meat was being portioned out. Then it happened. It wasn't the radio this time. It was a vibration, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that shook the very foundations of the stone walls. It wasn't an avalanche. It was the sound of heavy lifts H, 47 Chinooks. The survivors scrambled to their feet, cheering and sobbing, but William Wynne moved with tactical speed. He knew the helicopters couldn't land on the unstable snowpack. They would have to hover or find the clearing he had marked with GPS coordinates. "Smoky, let's go," he barked. He donned his gear, grabbed a canister of orange smoke, and prepared to breach the snow tunnel one last time. As he tunneled upward, the roar of the engines became deafening, a beautiful mechanical thunder that promised life. He burst through the surface into a world of blinding blue and white. Two massive helicopters were hovering 100 feet above the valley, their rotors kicking up a cyclonic storm of snow. William stood on the roof of his buried world, a lone figure in a tactical parka, and cracked a flare. A brilliant plume of orange smoke cut through the crystalline air. He didn't wave frantically like a victim. He stood at attention, signaling with the discipline of a soldier bringing his people home. The rescue crews looking down didn't see a crazy veteran. They saw a beacon of impossible survival. The evacuation took 6 hours. One by one, the 80 survivors were hoisted into the sky, away from the valley that had tried to claim them. As the last helicopter prepared to depart, the lead medic approached William Wynne. "Sir, we have room for you and the dog. Let's get you to a hospital." William looked back at his stone bunker, the place that was mocked in the sun and revered in the storm. He looked at Smoky, who was already sitting by the stone entrance, waiting for his master. William shook his head. "I have enough supplies for another month, and there's work to be done here. Someone needs to mark the properties before the thaw starts." The medic started to protest, then saw the look in William's moss-green eyes, a look of peace that comes from a mission accomplished. He simply nodded and handed William a fresh crate of medical supplies. As the last Chinook vanished over the ridge, silence returned to Blackwood Valley. But it wasn't the silence of death. It was the silence of a man who had proven that tradition, discipline, and the simple act of drying food can defeat the most modern of disasters. Months later, when the snow finally melted, they found the valley changed, but William's bunker stood exactly as it had. The settlers never mocked him again. In fact, every summer after that, you could see them on their porches, hanging strips of meat to dry, watching the hill where the veteran and his dog stood guard over the peace they had earned in the heart of the winter. The departure of the Chinooks didn't bring peace. It brought a vacuum. While the 80 survivors were safe, hundreds more remained scattered across the upper reaches of Blackwood, and the National Guard's reach was limited by a second front of storms hitting the coast. As the sun began to exert a weak, pale heat, the snow didn't just melt. It became a treacherous slurry that moved like slow-motion lava. Communication was still down. In this isolation, a different kind of predator emerged. Groups of men from the outskirts, desperate and opportunistic, began scavenging the abandoned luxury estates. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for generators, fuel, and jewelry. William Wynne watched from his ridge through a long-range spotting scope. He saw the black smoke of a non-survival fire rising from a neighboring ranch. He saw the way Smoky's hackles rose, his low growl sensing the arrival of men who didn't belong to the valley's rhythm. The veteran knew that the White Death was being replaced by human greed. He didn't wait for a sheriff who wouldn't come. He donned his tactical chest rig, checked the chamber of his long-range rifle, and whispered to Smoky, "The rescue is over, boy. Now comes a patrol." The valley was still cut off, and until the roads cleared, William Wynne was the only law left in the frost. The confrontation happened at the Miller estate. 3 men, driven by a desperate kind of adrenaline, were trying to break into a reinforced storage shed. They were armed with pry bars and a rusted shotgun, thinking the valley was their personal treasure chest. They didn't hear William Wynne. They didn't hear Smoky. One moment they were shouting at the lock. The next, the air was filled with a sound that froze their blood. A single, sharp bark that echoed off the stone walls like a gunshot. Step away from the door. William's voice was a low-frequency rumble that seemed to come from the mountain itself. He stepped out from behind a frozen oak, his rifle held in a relaxed but low-ready position. The man with the shotgun spun around, but he stopped mid-motion. He was looking into the eyes of a man who had stared down much worse than a common thief. William didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. Smoky was a coil of black and tan muscle, vibrating with the urge to neutralize the threat. "Drop it," William commanded. The weight of his experience, the sheer presence of a veteran who had outlasted the storm of the century, broke their nerve. The shotgun clattered into the slush. They saw not a man, but a guardian. William didn't turn them over to a non-existent police force. He gave them a choice. Work or leave. Start digging out the drainage pipes. Or start walking toward the pass. You have 10 seconds. But as the ice turned to water, a new catastrophe loomed. The massive snowpack on the higher ridges was melting too fast, and the valley floor was becoming a basin for a flash flood. The drainage pipes William had forced the scavengers to clear were just beginning. He realized the main bridge, the only ground route for the heavy equipment the National Guard was trying to send, was about to be swept away by a debris-filled torrent. William would gather the remaining able-bodied men, many of whom were the same settlers he'd saved. He didn't ask for permission. He organized them into a sandbagging line, using the very salt bags and grain sacks he'd stored in his bunker. Smoky worked alongside them, dragging heavy ropes to anchor the bridge's supports. The water was a chocolate-brown monster, carrying trees and remnants of houses. William stood waist-deep in the freezing flow, hammering steel pilings with a sledgehammer, his muscles screaming under the strain. He was a man possessed, a veteran fighting one last battle against the elements. If the bridge fell, the valley would stay isolated for months. As the water rose to his chest, he roared for the line to hold. In that moment, the people of Blackwood finally saw the true purpose of a soldier, not just to fight wars, but to be the foundation that refuses to wash away when the world turns to liquid. The bridge held, but the victory fell hollow as the floodwaters began to recede, leaving a thick, stinking layer sealed across the valley. The radio crackled back to life. It wasn't the National Guard this time. It was a distress signal from a remote communication outpost on the North Ridge, manned by 2 young technicians who had been forgotten in the chaos. They reported a group of unidentified hostiles attempting to seize the facility's high-power transmitters. William Wynne knew this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about control. In a world without a grid, whoever controlled the signal controlled the narrative. William looked at his reflection in a puddle of muddy meltwater. He saw a man who had hoped his fighting days were buried in the desert sands of a different continent. But the valley was his home now, and its people were his responsibility. He packed a specialized tactical kit, thermal optics, a suppressed sidearm, and K9 ballistic vest for Smoky. They moved out under the cover of a thick, low-hanging fog that clung to the melting snow like a shroud. The North Ridge was a vertical labyrinth of jagged rock and shifting ice. As they climbed, the temperature dropped again, turning the mud back into lethal glass. William didn't use a flashlight. He didn't need one. He had Smoky's nose and the muscle memory of 100 midnight raids. They were no longer rescuers. They were the hunters. The hostiles were not soldiers. They were desperate men with stolen gear, led by a charismatic former mercenary who saw the blackout as an opportunity to build a private fiefdom. They were currently trying to force the technicians to broadcast a signal claiming the valley was under their protection. William Wynne watched from the rafters of the equipment shed. He didn't want a firefight. He wanted a psychological surrender. He whispered a single command to Smoky, who slipped into the ventilation ducts with silent, predatory grace. Suddenly, the power to the shed's external floodlights cut out. William had found the junction box. In the total darkness, the only sound was a clicking of Smoky's claws on the metal floor and the low, guttural growl that seemed to move from one corner to the other. "Who's there?" the leader shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he swung his flashlight wildly. The beam caught William when standing in the doorway, illuminated by the pale moonlight behind him. He looked like an ancient spirit of vengeance. His moss-green eyes glowed with a cold, terrifying light. "You're trespassing on my mountain," William said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Before the leader could raise his weapon, Smoky launched from the shadows, a 30-kilogram blur of fur and fury that pinned the man to the ground without shedding a drop of blood. The others dropped their weapons instantly. They had realized that in Blackwood, there was only one predator at the top of the food chain. The signal was restored. Within hours, the world outside knew the truth. Blackwood Valley was still standing, held together by the grit of a single man. The National Guard finally mobilized a heavy ground convoy, led by massive plow trucks and armored supply carriers. But the roads were still a nightmare of black ice and unstable embankments. William Wynne, knowing the terrain better than any satellite map, volunteered to lead the convoy in from the pass. He sat in the lead vehicle, a rugged, vintage Humvee he'd kept in his bunker, with Smoky in the passenger seat. They were the pathfinders. As the massive trucks groaned behind them, William used his radio to guide them through the Dead Man's Curve, where the road narrowed to a thin shelf over 1,000-foot drop. He could feel the weight of the responsibility. One slip, and the supplies the valley so desperately needed would end up at the bottom of the canyon. The sun was finally breaking to the clouds for real now, turning the valley into a glittering, blinding diamond. When the first truck finally rolled over the bridge William had saved, the survivors, now hundreds of them, lined the muddy streets to cheer. But William didn't stop to celebrate. He led the convoy straight to the central square, stepped out of his vehicle, and began the one thing he knew best, organizing the distribution. He was a soldier back on duty, and until every mouth was fed, his watch wasn't over. With the arrival of the convoy, the immediate threat of starvation vanished, but a deeper, more insidious danger remained. The rapid thaw was unearthing more than just mud. It was exposing the structural failures of the valley's hasty modernization. Foundations were shifting in old mining tunnels, long forgotten by the developers, were beginning to fill with water and collapse. William Wynne, navigating the outskirts with Smoky, noticed a series of sinkholes forming near the primary medical tent city. The National Guard engineers were spread thin, focused on the main roads. William knew that if the ground gave way, the entire relief center would be swallowed. He spent his night studying old survey maps in his bunker, his moss-green eyes scanning for the intersection of modern greed and ancient geology. He found it. A massive drainage artery had been blocked by the construction of a luxury golf course 3 years prior. The water had nowhere to go but into the old shafts beneath the tents. Without waiting for a committee, William grabbed his remaining demolition charges, relics from his combat engineer days. He had to blow a bypass through the granite ridge to save the camp. It was a race against the clock and the saturated earth. As he set the timers, Smoky stayed at the perimeter, his ears tracking the subterranean groans of the shifting mountain. One man, one dog, and a handful of C4 were all that stood between the survivors and a secondary disaster. The blast saved the camp, but it also drew the attention of the corporate interests who owned the land. A team of lawyers and private security, arriving in the wake of the National Guard, attempted to serve William with a warrant for unauthorized demolition and destruction of property. They found him on his porch, cleaning his boots, with Smoky sitting like a statue of granite at his side. The lead attorney, a man in a suit that cost more than William's Humvee, started reciting a list of violations. William didn't look up until the man mentioned damages. Then the veteran stood. At 6'2" and built like a mountain, he dwarfed the city men. "I didn't destroy your property," William said, his voice a low vibration that made the air feel heavy. "I corrected your negligence. If I hadn't blown that ridge, your golf course would be at the bottom of a sinkhole, along with 300 people." Smoky let out a low, terrifying snarl, his amber eyes locked on the attorney's throat. The security team reached for their holsters, but stopped when they saw the look in William's eyes. The look of a man who had survived a war and a storm, and wasn't about to be bullied by a piece of paper. He handed the attorney a stack of photos he'd taken of the blocked drainage artery. "Take your warrant and leave. Or stay, and help the people you almost killed. Choose carefully." As the valley slowly returned to a state of managed chaos, William Wynne realized that the true test of a community isn't how they survive the storm, but how they handle the peace. The National Guard began to withdraw, leaving behind a civilian council to manage the long-term reconstruction. They asked William to lead the new Valley Security and Emergency Response Team. He looked at Smoky, then at the mountain that had nearly buried them all. He agreed, but on one condition: they would build a permanent community-owned storehouse, stocked with the very dried food and supplies they had once laughed at. He didn't want them to be dependent on a convoy that might not come next time. He spent the spring training the younger settlers, the ones who had seen the White Death firsthand, in the arts of survival, discipline, and foresight. He taught them how to read the clouds, how to cure meat, and how to listen to the mountain. He was no longer the crazy veteran or the paranoid neighbor. He was the architect of their resilience. As the last of the snow disappeared from the lower peaks, William stood on the ridge where he had first seen the storm gathering. He wasn't looking for another disaster. He was watching the smoke from 80 different chimneys, all of them prepared for whatever the next winter might bring. The thaw was complete, but it carved new fractures into the soul of Blackwood Valley. As the sun beat down on the mud and debris, a different kind of darkness was rising from the earth. The extreme saturation of the ground had activated old mining chemical runoff, contaminating the primary reservoir, the lifeblood of the newly established central camp. This wasn't a sudden, visible disaster. It was a silent poison. William Wynne, returning from patrol, noticed a subtle change. A faint metallic sheen on the water, a sickening chemical tang in the air, and the first cases of an unknown illness among the survivors. His combat engineer training instantly identified the threat. But the National Guard was fully withdrawn, and the civilian council, buried in legal paperwork from the luxury developers, dismissed his warning as paranoid rambling again. They were too busy dividing the dry land to worry about the unseen water. William looked at Smoky, who refused to drink from the stream. He knew that if he didn't act, the White Death would just be replaced by a corporate-caused sickness. He needed to find the source and neutralize the seepage. It was a race against time, as the chemical flow was accelerating toward the largest tent city. Once more, the veteran and his dog were the only defense against a valley that seemed determined to kill its new inhabitants. He donned his chemical suit and checked his water filtration system. The real battle for survival wasn't over. The battle against the silent poison was won in the dark, far from the cameras and the legal disputes. William Wynne and Smoky had tracked the seepage to a cracked containment wall in the lower mines, sealing it with a specialized underwater polymer before the toxins could reach the camp. It was a victory without a parade, exactly how William preferred it. Now, as a full year has passed since the Great Blizzard, Blackwood Valley has transformed. The modern cabins have been replaced by stone and timber structures modeled after William's bunker, practical, resilient, and honest. The settlers are now a community of survivors who understand that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. William stands on the ridge as the first frost of a new autumn begins to dust the peaks. He is older, the salt in his beard more silver than black, but his gaze is as sharp as a bayonet. He looks down at the valley and sees people who are no longer afraid of the clouds. They have their own storehouses, their own skills, and their own respect for the mountain. Smoky, graying around the muzzle but still powerful, sits at his side. The veteran knows his work here is mostly done, yet he will never truly leave. He is the spirit of the valley now, the man who dried meat while they mocked him, and the man who stood firm when the world turned to ice. As the wind begins to pick up, carrying the familiar scent of coming snow, William simply tightens his laces, adjusts his rucksack, and prepares for the watch. The mountain remembers, and so does the soldier,